3 years ago, a mother vanished without a trace on a seemingly peaceful morning, leaving behind a faded silver shawl and a shattered family. Rumors spread quickly, suspicion falling on her husband, while their young son silently believed his mother had never left. And then, an old tree in the backyard, where no one suspected, held the truth. What was found beneath its roots changed everything. Gentle sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting soft bands of light across the old wooden table. The crackling of the gas stove and the aroma of toast filled the air, mingling with Margaret's soft laughter as she turned to dodge small hands drawing wildly on her back. "Caleb," she said, feigning sternness, "Mommy's making breakfast. No coloring so close to me like that." The 9-year-old boy giggled, holding up his unfinished drawing. "I just wanted to show you Mommy wearing a superhero cape. When you get back, I'll finish coloring it." Margaret looked at her son with a tender gaze, the look of a mother who understood that nothing was more precious than these seemingly small things. "Okay," she bent down, gently kissing Caleb's forehead. "Mommy will be back before you finish coloring, okay?" He nodded, and Margaret turned back to Thomas, who was busy making coffee by the sink. Every morning, he used the exact coffee beans his wife loved the smell of, but he never drank it himself. A small habit between two people who had become as accustomed to each other as air. On the wall, the clock showed 6:12 a.m. Margaret glanced at it and said to Thomas, "I've prepared breakfast for you and Caleb. Make sure you both eat well." Thomas nodded, not taking his eyes off the boiling kettle. "I will. Don't go too deep into the woods, okay? I saw a report this morning about petty theft near the gas station behind us." Margaret shook her head and smiled. Thieves wouldn't bother this mum, would they? He didn't smile. Perhaps a vague premonition had just touched him. Margaret wrapped her arms around her husband's waist, pressing her face into his back for a few seconds. "I'm going for a walk. I'll be back in about half an hour. Remember to take your shawl. It's windy this morning," Thomas added, reaching for a ceramic mug on the rack. "I know." She smiled, draped a silver-grey shawl around her neck, and opened the door. Thomas stood still for a few seconds, watching his wife's figure through the frosted window pane. She walked past the white fence, turning left onto the trail leading to the edge of the forest, where she often went for early morning walks. She looked small in the vast landscape, but something about her gait made him feel strangely at peace. About 10 minutes later, as Thomas sat down at the table, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Mrs. May, the neighbor living near the edge of the forest, looking flustered. "Thomas, I'm not sure what's happened, but I was just exercising near the edge of the forest, by the old pine tree, and there's something on the grass. I think it's Margaret's shawl." Thomas frowned. "She only left the house less than half an hour ago." He didn't wait to hear more. His legs moved quickly, crossing the fence, following the familiar path into the forest. His hurried footsteps shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. The old pine tree was right on the edge of the trail, where Margaret often stopped for a few minutes before turning back. There, Thomas found the silver-grey shawl lying on the dew-covered grass. Margaret wasn't there. There was no sign that anyone had been standing there for long. Only the shawl. He walked over and picked it up. A gentle breeze blew. The shawl was still warm. Thomas stood still for a long time. Something felt strange in his head, but he couldn't name it. No footprints, no scratches, no sounds. Just the cold emptiness of the early morning forest. He called out loudly, "Margaret! Where are you?" There was no answer. Only the sound of wind rustling through the leaves. By the side of the road, a fledgling sparrow trembled as it hopped across, flying up into a tree, as if it too had just been startled by something. Thomas looked around, trying to find anything that could be a clue. A strand of hair, a footprint, a distant sound. But no, nothing. He touched the base of the pine tree. There were a few faint scratches on the trunk. It wasn't clear if they were from broken branches or something else. Thomas reported it to the police that morning. A search was launched, with sniffer dogs, drones, and local residents assisting, but nothing, not a single trace. Margaret seemed to have vanished from the world, in the middle of a peaceful morning, without leaving any farewell. Caleb didn't ask anything all afternoon. He just sat in his room, still holding his unfinished drawing. The word "Mom" was written in blue ink in the corner of the paper, crooked but clear. As night fell, he placed the drawing on his desk, then opened a drawer and took out a plastic necklace, a gift his mother had made from beads. He put it around his neck, squeezing it gently. It felt like a hug. Thomas stood outside his son's door, his hand on the doorknob, but not pushing it open. He looked at the light still shining from the room, the glow flickering from the crack under the door. And his heart ached. He knew he had to say something, do something. But there were no rules for someone who had just lost his wife for no reason. He feared every word would be an affirmation of the worst. The shawl was then folded neatly and left on the hastily erected altar. No one dared call it a funeral, because there was no body, no evidence, no farewell. The last book she was reading was still lying open on the table, its spine marked with a purple bookmark, printed with the words, "No tomorrow is more precious than today." There was only a very large, empty space in the armchair in the living room, where Margaret used to sit and read every morning, and a question no one dared to speak aloud. Why would someone like Margaret, a mother who was always on time, meticulous in every detail, suddenly disappear as if she had never existed? The shawl was there, but the person was gone. A week after Margaret disappeared, silence became part of the house. Not the gentle quiet that usually existed every morning, but a heavy, thick silence, seemingly soaking into the walls, seeping into every crack of the wooden floor. The grey shawl still lay neatly on the makeshift altar. Every time he passed by, Thomas glanced at it, a habit repeated many times throughout the day, even though he didn't understand why. Maybe he hoped that if he looked enough, something would appear. A message, a clue, an answer. But there was nothing, still just a silent piece of fabric. The police came almost every day during the first week. They asked the same series of questions over and over, in different ways. Are you sure she hasn't shown any signs of depression lately? Any conflicts? Any recent arguments? Are you in debt, Thomas? Does she have anyone else close that you don't know about? Thomas answered everything. His voice was even, unwavering. But by the 5th day, he couldn't stand it anymore and blurted out, "Do you think I killed my wife?" The police officer didn't answer directly, just looked at him and wrote something down. That was enough. When Thomas returned to work, a small construction company in town, all eyes were on him, as if he had just walked out of a courtroom. Colleagues who had once teased him for being too in love with his wife were now completely silent. During lunch breaks, he sat alone in the farthest corner. Some people looked at him and nudged their friends, whispering and turning away. That afternoon, the manager called him into his private office. "Thomas, I know this is a difficult time, but perhaps you should take more leave, at least until things are clear." Clear? What needed to be clear? Margaret had disappeared, his wife. No farewell, no trace. What else wasn't clear? But Thomas didn't argue. He nodded, stood up, and left quietly, like someone who had grown accustomed to living in silence. At school, Caleb didn't fare any better. Some classmates started whispering behind his back. Once, during recess, a boy from another class stopped him in the hallway. "Your mum's dead. Your dad killed her. Everyone knows it. Caleb stood still, not crying, not speaking, just pursing his lips, then walking away. He went straight to the bathroom and stood there for 10 minutes. When he came out, his eyes were dry. But that afternoon, he tore up the unfinished drawing, the picture of his mother in a superhero cape that he had promised to finish coloring. That evening, Thomas closed the bathroom door and turned the water on full blast. He looked in the mirror, at the face of a man he no longer recognized. Stubble covered his face. Dark circles under his eyes were like streaks of spreading ink. Where did Margaret really go? Why could she disappear without a trace like that? The question echoed in his head like a repeating loop in a news report that he couldn't turn off. He slammed his hand against the mirror. Cracks spread like a spider web, reflecting his face in fragments. A broken man. Thomas slumped to the floor, sobbing, not out loud, just silent tears falling, mixing with the sound of running water and the meaninglessness of everything that was happening. The next morning, an old friend visited. He had been the best man at their wedding. He sat in the chair opposite Thomas, mechanically rotating his teacup. "Are you okay?" "Okay," Thomas said, his voice emotionless. The friend looked around the room, stopping at the family photo on the bookshelf. The photo showed the three of them in the park last spring. Margaret smiling radiantly, holding Caleb wearing a red hat. Thomas stood beside her, his arm casually around his wife's shoulder. He sighed, then said, as if talking to himself, "I know what people are saying. I still believe you're a good person, but you should also prepare for the worst." The space froze. Thomas didn't react, not angry, just silent. Then stood up, walked to the bookshelf, picked up the photo, and gripped it tightly in his hand. The friend left a few minutes later, without saying anything more. The door closed, leaving Thomas alone in the living room. He opened his hand. The photo was crumpled, but not torn. One corner of the photo was folded over, right over Margaret's face. He didn't smooth it out, nor did he throw it away, just gently placed it back on the shelf. Not flattened, not straightened, as if wanting to preserve that distortion as an undeniable truth. That night Thomas didn't sleep. He lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. The ticking of the clock was like the sound of something irretrievable dripping away. He didn't know where Margaret was, didn't know what had happened. But one thing he knew, for sure, from the moment the shawl fell on that patch of grass, he was no longer himself. Not because Margaret was missing, but because everyone believed that he might be the reason she didn't return. 3 years had passed since the morning his mother didn't return. Caleb didn't ask any more questions, not because he understood, but because he realized adults didn't want to talk about his mother. The question, "Where's Mom?" always made his dad look away, and Mrs. May, the neighbor, avoided him as if he had stepped on a thorn. So he stopped asking, but he still listened. Every morning, Caleb woke up earlier than usual. He didn't eat breakfast right away, but sat by the living room window, hugging a pillow, his eyes fixed on the small road in front of the house. Every time a woman passed by, whether it was the mail carrier, the milk lady, or a stranger walking for exercise, Caleb looked at her for a long time until her figure disappeared behind the trees. He didn't run out and call, didn't cry either, just watched. Little by little, his eyes filled with what his mouth no longer said. "Is that Mom?" At school, Caleb still attended classes regularly, but he didn't participate in any games, didn't talk to friends, didn't raise his hand to answer questions like before. He sat at the back of the class, quiet as an empty chair. The teacher tried to call his name, invite him to speak, ask him questions, but Caleb just nodded or shook his head. Not because he didn't know, but because what was going on in his head was louder than anything the classroom could offer. Once, during recess, she saw Caleb sitting alone under a tree in the schoolyard. He was playing with fallen leaves, arranging them in the shape of a person lying down. When she approached, Caleb released his hand. The leaves scattered. He stood up, bowed his head, and walked straight into class. Thomas eventually took Caleb to see a child psychologist. The room was decorated with colorful stuffed animals and drawing boards, but Caleb didn't touch anything. He sat still, his hands on his lap, his eyes looking at the floor. The doctor asked his name, asked about school, about friends, about his mother. Caleb didn't answer, just blinked once when he heard the word mother. No one knew what he was thinking, and the doctor didn't push him. The meeting ended in silence. Adults called it a psychological barrier, but for Caleb, he just felt that no one in that room could hear the real voice in his head. One afternoon, Caleb passed by the living room and accidentally overheard his dad talking on the phone. His dad's voice was low, quiet, and tired. "I think I'll probably sell the house and move somewhere else. I can't live here anymore. Every time I look at something, I'm reminded of her." Caleb stood frozen behind the half-closed door. He didn't fully understand the meaning of the words, but the words, "sell the house," made his stomach clench. This house was the last place his mother had walked out of, where the shawl still lay, where there were traces of his mother left behind. If this house was gone, where would his mother return to? That night, in his room, Caleb drew a house. He drew walls, a roof, a door, but didn't draw windows. A house without windows, because if no one was waiting for his mother to return, then no one needed light anymore. One day, during writing class, the teacher gave the class the prompt: if one day you lost someone you loved, what would you do? Caleb sat for a long time. It wasn't until the other students had submitted their papers that he wrote a short passage. The handwriting was stiff, somewhat scrawled, but each word was clearly readable. "I don't know where my mother went, but I'm sure she didn't leave me. Because my mother once said, if I go somewhere without saying goodbye, it's because someone kidnapped me. My mother didn't leave me." The teacher read that passage in the afternoon when grading papers. She was speechless, not because of the words, but because of the calm tone in the face of such great pain. The next day, she sent the passage to Thomas, along with a small note. "I think Caleb hasn't lost touch with his emotions. He's just holding them back too tightly." That evening, Thomas read and reread the short passage 10 times. He sat on the bed, the dim yellow light reflecting on the paper. He vaguely remembered Margaret saying that sentence once, when playing hide-and-seek with Caleb in the garden. "Remember, if I go somewhere without saying goodbye, it's because someone kidnapped me. I would never leave you on my own." It was a casual joke, a gentle type of conversation between mother and son. But now, it became the strongest testimony a child could carry throughout his life. Thomas walked softly to Caleb's room. The boy was lying with his back turned, hugging a pillow, silent. Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "I read it. Your writing." Caleb didn't turn around, but his shoulder trembled slightly. "You know," Thomas choked, "your mother said that sentence to me once too." Caleb was still silent. Thomas didn't say anything more. He leaned down, gently hugging his son. The first time in weeks he had dared to do so. Caleb still didn't cry, but his hands clutched tightly at his dad's shirt, as if afraid that letting go would mean there was nothing left. That night, Thomas didn't sleep on the sofa as usual. He lay beside Caleb, listening to his even breathing, and thought, maybe. Margaret had never disappeared. She was still here, in her son's memories, in every small detail, every sentence that seemed to have faded away. And if his son still remembered, still believed, then he would believe too. Believe that memory could be a pathway. And Caleb, the boy who had been called lost, might be the only one who could see what all the adults had overlooked. Thomas didn't tell anyone, not friends, not neighbors, not even Caleb's teacher. That morning, he just woke his son up earlier than usual, packed a few sets of clothes, folded blankets, put textbooks and some old toys into 2 small cardboard boxes. The old pickup truck started with a harsh sputter. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. On his lap was a wooden box, the only thing he carried himself. No one asked who was taking what. No one checked the luggage. Each person just kept what they couldn't leave behind. Throughout the 3-hour drive, the two of them barely spoke. Thomas played soft music, but the sound was just a faint echo. Caleb occasionally turned to look at his dad, his eyes not blaming, not afraid. Just a silent, waiting look. The houses gradually receded behind them. The familiar town faded in the rearview mirror, as if it had never contained an entire life. Thomas's uncle's old house was in the suburbs, near a small forest, far from the town centre. It had been many years since anyone had lived there regularly. The tin roof was faded silver, the lawn overgrown. On the path leading to the porch, the paving stones were sunken or cracked, undulating like signs of time untouched. Caleb got out of the car and looked around. He didn't say anything, just pulled the wooden box closer to him, as if afraid the new place would swallow it. Thomas went to open the house door. The wooden door creaked open with a long creak, like a sigh. Inside, the smell of mold was noticeable, but not unpleasant. Just the smell of memories that hadn't been touched for too long. He turned on the light. The dim yellow bulb flickered a few times and then lit up, shining down on the layer of dust covering the photo frames, bookshelves, and the wall clock that had stopped ticking. Thomas looked around and sighed softly. "We'll clean it up. It'll be okay." Caleb didn't respond. He walked straight to the back of the house, where there was a small yard that had once been used for growing vegetables. In the middle of the yard, a large tree had fallen over, its roots protruding as if trying to cling to something. Grass grew mixed with the roots, embracing it as part of the earth. The boy stood in front of that tree for a long time. He reached out and touched the rough bark, his eyes looking up at the trunk that had fallen in one direction, as if bowing its head. In the dim golden light, the old tree became unusually gentle, like an old man quietly resting after years of storms. "Did you ever play here, Dad?" Caleb asked, his voice as light as a breath. Thomas was startled and turned around. That question pulled him back to his long-lost childhood. He slowly nodded. "Yes, I used to hide behind this tree when playing tag with your uncle. I even fell asleep under the tree once, and Grandpa scolded me for skipping meals." Caleb smiled softly, a rare smile after a long time, without smiling. He lowered his head, placing his hand on the roots, as if touching his father's memories. Thomas was about to say something, but then fell silent. There are moments when words only dilute what needs to be preserved. That evening, the two of them ate takeout they had bought along the way. No one asked to watch TV. There was no Wi-Fi, no ringing phones, only the sound of insects outside and the dim yellow light shining on the old walls. When Thomas finished cleaning the dishes, he saw Caleb sitting cross-legged in the middle of the room, the wooden box in front of him. He took out each picture, all images of his mother cooking, his mother watering plants, his mother sitting and reading. Each image was drawn with pencil, some lines faint, some dark, but all containing a very special detail: her hair tied low, a small pattern on her shirt, a slight smile that only Caleb could remember so accurately. He took a blank sheet of paper and started to draw. Soon after, Thomas quietly sat down next to him. The boy had finished the drawing, a tree leaning over, roots protruding, surrounded by weeds. This time, unlike the previous paintings, Caleb colored it in. He used light green for the grass, dark brown for the roots, and a little light orange lightly spread on the horizon, which he always said was the light Mum left behind every time she walked away. Below, he wrote in simple but very bold letters, "Mum is always somewhere beside us." When Caleb stood up, he hugged the painting he had just drawn, taking it into the bedroom. Before lying down, he quietly tucked the painting into a crack in the wall, right above his head, like planting a flag, marking the position of something sacred. That night, he hugged the painting to sleep, as if hugging a physical part of his mother in this too-quiet world. Thomas sat back in the living room, the light reflecting on the wooden table. He opened the window and looked out into the backyard. The fallen tree still lay there, like an old watchman, quietly keeping something no one knew for sure. The weather was mild, a day like any other. Thomas stood on the porch, his hands on his hips, looking out at the backyard, where the large tree still lay fallen like a giant sleeping body. Beside it, the excavator was preparing to set the digging arm in position. Thomas pointed to the protruding roots. "Cut here first, then hook down to the base. I plan to renovate this place into a vegetable garden." Before the worker started the engine, Thomas turned to his son. "Go inside and rest. It's dusty out here." Caleb didn't respond. He still stood still, his hands in his hoodie pockets, his eyes fixed on the tree. After a moment, he gently shook his head. "I want to stay. Just watch." Thomas was about to ask more, but then stopped. That look, silent, deep, and strangely stubborn, made him unable to stop him. Thomas glanced at his son, and then turned back to instruct the worker. He couldn't see Caleb's eyes fixed on the tree, as if it was saying something that only he could understand. The engine roared, digging up the hard soil in chunks. Decayed roots broke apart, releasing a strong, earthy smell. As the excavator shovel prepared to dig deeper into the center of the tree, Caleb suddenly shouted, "Stop!" The worker was startled and released the controls. Thomas turned around sharply. Caleb had rushed forward, his arms outstretched to block the excavator. "Stop! Don't touch my mom!" The worker looked at Thomas in confusion, scratching his head, not knowing what to do. As for Thomas, his heart pounded. He had never seen Caleb react so strongly. Not when he was bullied at school, not when he saw his mother's makeshift altar, not when he was forced to leave the old house. Only at this moment. Only when the tree was being dug up. Caleb wasn't just shouting. He was crying. The crying wasn't loud, wasn't screaming, but a stifled sound, as if his throat couldn't convey all that his heart was screaming. "Mum's here. Mum left it for me. Don't destroy it. Don't..." Thomas stood still. His son's disjointed words rang out like lightning in broad daylight, partly out of fear, partly because he couldn't explain why he also felt the need to believe. Let me dig the rest myself," Thomas said to the worker. "Take a break." The worker shrugged, retreating to the porch, not forgetting to turn off the engine and sit down to smoke, his eyes still darting around at the strange scene. Father and son knelt beside the tree. Thomas took off his jacket, threw it aside, and used his hands to rake up large handfuls of the thick soil. Caleb didn't say anything more, but his movements were hasty, almost desperate. After the dry topsoil passed, a layer of moist black soil was revealed. Thomas felt something hard under his hand. He pushed more soil away, trembling slightly. A small crack sounded. Something nylon hit his fingertips. Thomas slowly pulled it out. A black plastic bag, wrapped very carefully, each layer tied with brittle rubber bands. He pulled out a small knife from his pocket, carefully cutting each ring. At the last layer, the smell of damp earth and a very light, very familiar scent escaped. He opened the bag. Caleb held his breath. Inside were 3 items: a scrap of fabric, slightly torn, but still clearly showing the 3 letters Caleb embroidered in red thread. The stitching was neat, curved like the smile of the person who embroidered it. A silver-grey shawl, the very one Margaret used to wear every morning. The scent of lavender still lingered on the worn fabric. A cash transfer receipt dated 3 years ago, with the recipient being a tailoring workshop in the suburbs, and the sender's name, M.D. Thomas raised the fabric close to his face. A small corner was still covered in dirt, but the letters Caleb were still clear. His hand trembled slightly. The stitching was uneven, with some parts protruding from the fabric. Exactly the type of embroidery Margaret had learned when she was first pregnant. He remembered as if it was yesterday, when she pricked her finger with a needle and laughed. "Mummy's not good at sewing yet, but you'll remember that Mummy tried." That sentence now echoed in his head like a silent punch. Caleb pressed the shawl to his face, inhaling lightly, and his eyes blinked rapidly, as if holding back something about to spill out. He took the fabric, trembling. He touched each stitch, the letters representing his own name, embroidered by his mother. "Do you see, Dad?" he whispered, his eyes red. "My mother didn't leave me. She was waiting for me to find her." Thomas looked up at his son, then back at the bag of items. In that moment, all the emotions that had been bottled up for 3 years, pain, remorse, humiliation, helplessness, all burst out like a broken dam. He covered his face and burst into tears. For the first time since Margaret disappeared, Thomas wept not out of despair, but because a glimmer of hope had just appeared. Fragile, but clear. A while later, Thomas sat leaning against the tree, still holding the crumpled receipt. Caleb placed all 3 items on his lap, hugging them like treasures. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. Caleb nodded. "I don't know why, but I feel, this place. My mother was here." Thomas looked at the tree, the broken trunk, the protruding roots, the upturned soil, and it suddenly looked different. No longer a part of his childhood, but a milestone in time that no one had opened. That day, Thomas didn't call the police. He carefully took the bag of items into the house, cleaned them, photographed the receipt, and did a preliminary search for the name of the tailoring workshop. Every action he took was careful, slow, like someone daring to cross the border of doubt for the first time. As for Caleb, he took the fabric embroidered with his name to his room, placing it next to the drawing of the tree, and whispered, "Mom left a message. I heard it." Thomas sat at his uncle's old desk, flipping the receipt back and forth. On the corner of the receipt was a small line of text, the ink blurred. "Shipment transfer, temporary receipt." Below was a series of numbers. Not an address, but an internal delivery route code. Thomas opened the old computer and typed the phrase into the search bar. A website appeared, but there was only one result leading to an abandoned industrial park in the suburbs, about 100 kilometers away. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He only knew that after 3 years of being submerged in suspicion and pain, this was the first time he felt. A small door was opening. 3 o'clock in the morning. Thomas sat in the darkness of the living room, the desk lamp casting a dim light on the file he had just printed from the industrial park website. The numbers on the receipt matched an unregistered tailoring workshop located on the edge of the suburbs, a place so remote that Google Maps only showed one name: Workshop 7, Zone G. No specific address, no manager information, just a silent pin on the screen. Just as dawn was breaking, Thomas prepared the car. Full tank of gas, snacks, drinks, charger, and a spare phone. He didn't tell anyone, not even the police. Nothing was clear, and Thomas didn't trust anyone but himself. He went to Caleb's room. The boy was awake, wearing his jacket, his mother's shawl tied across his shoulders like a sash, silent but intentional. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, his voice soft. Caleb nodded. "Then let's go. Let's go pick up your mum." The boy looked at his dad, his eyes confirming something that didn't need to be said. Before getting in the car, Caleb turned to look at the old house. He walked to the fallen tree, bent down, picked up a small handful of soil, and put it in his pocket. Thomas looked, but didn't ask. He knew that for Caleb, this wasn't just a trip, but a journey carrying a piece of memory. As the car rolled out of the gate, the boy turned his head for one last look. The painting of the tree was still stuck on the window of his room, the paper fluttering slightly in the wind. The long drive of nearly 100 kilometers passed with little conversation. The radio was on at a very low volume, repeating a wordless tune. Caleb leaned his head against the window, his eyes wide, looking at the misty scenery passing by. After a while, he opened the small wooden box, took out the piece of fabric embroidered with his name, and gently stroked the letters, as if counting each heartbeat. Thomas glanced over, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He wasn't sure what was waiting for them, but for the first time, he saw that Caleb was no longer a child to be protected. He was walking beside him, like a companion. Around 9 in the morning, they arrived at the area marked on the map. The entrance was a narrow and desolate dirt road leading to a cluster of dilapidated factory buildings. There were at least 5 rows of buildings, all covered in dust, the walls stained, the tin roofs grey-black from the weather. A large iron gate stood leaning, locked with a rusty chain. Inside, there were shadows of people, 3, maybe 4 men, standing or sitting around the factory doors, their appearance not belonging to a legitimate production facility. Thomas stopped the car 200 meters away and turned off the engine. Caleb sat up straight. "What are we going to do, Dad?" "Pretend to be job seekers," Thomas replied, after a few seconds of consideration. "I'll ask around, find the way. If it gets dangerous, turn the car around immediately." Caleb nodded. He took off his mother's shawl, rolled it up, and put it in his pocket. Not because he was afraid others would see it, but because he was afraid of losing it while looking for his mother. They walked slowly through the gate, their eyes immediately attracting attention. A man in his 30s, with a buzz cut and wearing an old t-shirt, stepped out to block their way. "Looking for someone?" Thomas smiled slightly, scratching his head. "I heard you need workers here. My wife used to sew, and I know how to carry things. Both of us are unemployed now." The man looked Thomas up and down, then looked down at Caleb. "Does the kid know how to work too?" Thomas hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "He helps his mother sew buttons. He's good with his hands. He learns fast." The man sneered. "That's perfect. Small, skillful, doesn't eat much." Thomas gritted his teeth, clenching his fists. Caleb stood still, his eyes not blinking at all. The man pointed. "Follow me." He led them through the first row of buildings, where the wooden doors were padlocked. The destination was a row of workshops in the back. The walls were peeling, the iron sliding doors were dented. As soon as he entered the workshop area, Thomas felt a pair of eyes stop on him. Not a hostile gaze, but something like recognition. From afar, among the women carrying rolls of fabric, a skinny girl glanced at him and Caleb, then turned away immediately, walking quickly to the back area of the workshop. Thomas only caught a glimpse of her thin back, but in that brief moment he saw her eyes widen as if she had seen something unexpected. Before he could react, the man leading the way turned around, his voice harsh. "Follow me. Don't stray." Thomas swallowed his confusion, but he still noticed the girl's eyes were not those of a guard, but of someone who had been afraid and wanted to say something. As they approached the entrance of the third workshop, a young woman stepped out of the building, the same woman he had seen before. She was wearing a long-sleeved t-shirt, her figure thin, her face covered in dust, her hair disheveled. When her eyes met Caleb's, then shifted to Thomas, she stopped. The look of recognition was unmistakable. In a moment of hesitation, she raised her hand to her lips to signal shh, then walked closer, pretending to bend down to pick something up from the ground. The movement was so natural that no one noticed. The guards were busy talking. She whispered quickly into Thomas's ear, her voice lost in her breath. "I know you. Margaret showed me pictures of you and your son. She asked me to pass on a message when you came." Thomas stiffened. Caleb stood frozen. Margaret?" Thomas asked softly. The girl nodded slightly, her eyes glistening. "She used to tell me a lot about you two. About the house with the wooden window frames. About the son who never forgets his mother. Now listen to me. Don't say anything. Stand here a little longer, then leave this place. I'll meet you later, somewhere safer. A diner by the highway, faded sign, 4 o'clock. After speaking, she quietly walked away, disappearing behind a worn fabric curtain. Before leaving, she turned her head, looked at Caleb, and said softly, "She often talked about you. Said you were the reason she was still alive today." When they got outside, they sat in the car for a long time. No one said a word. The wind outside blew gently, blowing both the belief that had just flickered, trembling, and so fragile, but enough to pull the two of them forward. They stopped at a small diner on the highway, exactly as the woman had instructed. They didn't know if this was a trap or a real ray of hope, but at least their investigation was making progress. Outside, the faded sign rattled lightly in the wind. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet. The two of them chose a corner table, away from curious eyes. The girl appeared after 10 minutes. She was wearing a baseball cap, a medical mask, and a baggy men's shirt, her hands still showing a few unhealed red scratches. She didn't look up as she walked in, but her eyes immediately recognized them. She pulled up a chair, her hands still trembling slightly. When she sat down, her eyes lingered on Caleb for a few seconds. She took a glass of water from the self-service tray, but didn't drink it. Placing her hand on the table, she said so softly that Thomas had to lean closer to hear, "I've been waiting a long time to tell you what she asked me to say, because she believed you would definitely come." Caleb didn't say anything, but his hand had been on the table for some time now, gently tapping a steady rhythm, a habit he used to have when waiting for his mother to cook in the old days. She sat down, didn't order any food, didn't ask any questions, just started with a sigh. She was stronger than anyone I've ever met. Her name was Emily, 26 years old, dropped out of school early, had worked temporary jobs, and was lured to the illegal tailoring workshop by a broker with promises of high wages and free accommodation. The reality was a disguised prison. She began to tell her story, her voice even, as if each word had to be pulled up from the deepest part of her memory. That day, about 3 years ago, I was taken to Workshop G. At the time, it was one of the 4 areas that were operating. At first, I thought I was actually going to work. But on the second night, when I asked about the contract, they locked me in a closed room. Margaret. She was brought in about a week later. She had been drugged beforehand. I heard she was abducted while walking alone. Caleb gripped his mother's shawl tightly in his hand. Thomas didn't take his eyes off Emily. When she woke up, she was panicked, crying, resisting. Then she was beaten. Every day she worked from 6 in the morning to 1 in the morning the next day. No pay, no paperwork, not allowed to go outside. Inside the workshop, there were no windows. Each person was only allowed to sleep 3 hours a day, lying on wooden planks placed close to the ground. In the winter, the floor was so cold that anyone who wasn't careful would get pneumonia. In the summer, it was as hot as a boiler. Some people fainted while sewing, but they wouldn't let them rest. They just splashed water on their faces and made them keep working. Margaret, she was beaten once for daring to share her bread with someone who was sick. I remember her eyes were swollen and purple for days. Hearing this, Caleb clenched his hands even tighter in his lap, his fingernails almost digging into his skin. The guards took her phone and burned all her documents. Told her she was paying off a debt, $50,000 in rescue costs. She didn't understand, but gradually she knew it was a way to legitimize her imprisonment. Thomas leaned back. His whole body was cold. He imagined his wife, the woman who used to wake up early to prepare breakfast, the one who carefully wrote labels for Caleb's pencil box, being thrown into a dark, nameless workshop with no way out. Margaret was the only one who didn't break, even though she was stripped of everything. She told me a lot about Thomas, about Caleb. She described the look in her son's eyes every time he was hugged. She even drew a picture of a house on a napkin and said, "Our house is white. The windows have wooden frames. We grow purple flowers on the porch." Caleb planted them. The first flowers bloomed on his birthday. Caleb bowed his head. He didn't know when he had started crying. Emily took out a small, crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. "I've kept this until now." She asked me to write it down because she was afraid she would forget. She pushed the paper over. On it, the handwriting was scrawled, "If Caleb still remembers me, he will find me at the tree." When she found out she was being transferred, Emily continued, she panicked. She hugged me and cried, then begged, "If you escape, go to this address and leave a little piece of my memory under the tree there. Maybe Caleb will see it." I escaped a few weeks later. I faked a serious illness. They sent me back to my hometown with a hospital transfer certificate. I didn't go home right away. I went straight to that place. I sat in front of the old house for 2 days, waiting until night. Then I sneaked into the yard and dug a hole around the tree to put the objects she sent down. I wasn't sure if anyone would ever come back, but I promised her. I remember. The day I dug that hole, it was raining. I only had a plastic spoon, and my hands were all scratched up. But I didn't stop because I was afraid I would regret it for the rest of my life. After burying them, I sat beside that tree all night, praying that she was still alive. Every time a car drove by, I thought maybe she would come back, see it. Thomas couldn't say anything. He just nodded, then turned away. He felt choked up, like there was a stone in his throat. Caleb then reached up and touched his pocket, where he kept the handful of soil from the fallen tree. His hand gripped it tightly, as if he had embraced his entire mother in that handful of soil. They changed the places of confinement constantly. I heard Margaret was transferred to the western area, where fewer people knew about it. She's probably still there now, if she's still alive. Emily suddenly stopped. Her eyes turned red, but her voice still tried to remain steady. No. Not if. When. When she is still alive. Because she always repeated something like a mantra. I am alive. Because Caleb still remembers me. She bowed her head, hiding her face. Tears fell onto her sleeve. On the way home, the car was silent. Thomas was driving, but his mind was still somewhere in the prison camp. Every word Emily said still rang clearly in his head, like a hammer pounding into his heart. Caleb fell asleep beside him, his head tilted to one side, his lips still mumbling something. When Thomas leaned closer, he only caught a broken fragment. "I never forgot you." He turned back to the front, his eyes blurred with tears. The streetlights flowed along the car window like stars falling within reach. And on his chest, where Thomas had temporarily pinned Margaret's notebook, there was still the smell of old fabric, the smell of faded ink, and the warmth of someone who had never disappeared from the family's memory. The report was sent to the local police station the next morning. Thomas, holding Margaret's notebook in his hand, sat opposite a young lieutenant with sharp eyes. The notes in the book, the testimony of the surviving girl, and the tightly linked pieces of information made everything no longer a vague suspicion. "They change locations constantly," Thomas said, his voice deep but certain. "But there's a clue in the notebook, the shipping code and recent delivery routes." The lieutenant read carefully and nodded. "We've been watching that area. But we lack evidence. If you agree to testify and hand over the original notebook, we will conduct an inspection today." Thomas didn't hesitate. He placed the notebook on the table. "I only ask one thing. If you find her, let me be there." That afternoon, a plainclothes police car, without insignia, quietly parked in front of the factory area on the western edge of town, the area noted in the notebook as "where the light doesn't reach." 4 other cars appeared soon after. The forces divided into 3 directions, surrounding the outside, penetrating the main area, and blocking escape routes. Thomas stood inside one car, gripping the strap of his shoulder bag tightly, where he kept Margaret's grey shawl. Caleb was kept in a civilian car 100 meters away, with a female officer sitting beside him to reassure him. The boy sat quietly, holding the notebook his mother had written, his head resting against the window. In Caleb's hand, the notebook was creased, some pages yellowed, but he still flipped back and forth to the first page, where his mother had written the first line in shaky handwriting. "I don't know when you will read this, but I believe you will come." The boy didn't cry, just kept that look, steadfast, as if he blinked, he would miss the moment his mother walked out. The raid took place in 8 minutes. The sound of iron doors being cut, the sound of police dogs barking, the sound of tables and chairs being overturned, shouting, struggling, the smell of dusty fabric, the smell of damp sweat, the smell of panic mixed in an atmosphere as tense as a drawn bow. Thomas walked behind the 3rd group of investigators, allowed to follow closely under supervision. He saw women running out of the cramped rooms, thin, pale-faced, barefoot, hands covering their heads. Some were crying, some just sat down on the ground, not moving, as if they couldn't believe they had just escaped. An officer shouted, "Someone is hiding in the fabric room. The last corner, the wooden door is locked." Thomas immediately rushed after them. Thomas walked through each room, his eyes darting around non-stop. Each area that passed was a knife. Each woman he saw made his heart stop for fear of mistaking, or of being right without realizing it. In one room, there was a calendar hanging from 3 years ago, still showing a picture of lavender flowers, the flower Margaret liked. He stood still for a few seconds, then continued, his breath as rapid as someone running through memories. The room was dark. The smell of old, damp fabric was heavy. The flashlight beam swept across. In the corner of the room, between the stacks of fabric that reached the ceiling, there was a huddled shape. Thomas entered. He saw a woman trembling, her hands hugging her legs, her long hair covering most of her face. "Margaret," he called, his voice completely hoarse. The woman raised her head. Their eyes met. Margaret couldn't believe it. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't burst into tears, just opened her eyes wide, looking at Thomas as if she was seeing an old dream come true. "Thomas." Her voice was as light as the wind. He nodded, unable to speak. She looked around, then back at him, startled. "Where's Caleb? Where's my son?" "Here," a small voice rang out behind Thomas. Caleb had run in. No one could stop him. The boy walked past his father, slowly, surely, and not taking his eyes off the skinny woman sitting huddled among the fabric. He stopped in front of his mother, bent down, and took out from his pocket the shawl his mother used to wear, the one that had accompanied him throughout the journey. He held it out, without saying a word. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached up and touched the shawl. Her lips pursed tightly, her eyes blurred. Caleb didn't wait any longer. He stepped forward and hugged his mother tightly, his face pressed against his mother's neck, his arms squeezing her back, not crying, not screaming, just a hug that contained 3 years of waiting. Margaret leaned down, her hands cupping her son's head, forehead touching forehead. She said through sobs, "I kept your picture in my head for 3 years. I was afraid one day I would forget your smile. But you're still just like I remember." Caleb pulled away slightly, looking straight into his mother's eyes. The place where Mum was waiting for me was the exact spot. The next day, all 3 of them sat together in the hospital's temporary isolation room. Margaret was undergoing a health check and waiting for the results. Caleb was asleep on the couch, his head resting on his mother's lap. Thomas made 2 cups of hot tea, placing one beside his wife's hand. Thomas opened his bag and took out the old grey shawl, the shawl that had been Margaret's last trace for 3 years. He gave it to his wife. Margaret took it, raised it to her face, and closed her eyes for a long time. "I never thought I'd ever touch anything that was mine again. I thought I had vanished." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You never vanished. It's just that we didn't go deep enough to find you." "I do not know where to start," Thomas said quietly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at her son sleeping soundly, then turned to Thomas, her eyes still swollen, but her gaze clear. "Just start over. As long as we meet each other, that's all that matters." Outside the window, the sun was just dawning. In the quiet room, amidst the soft beeping of the heart rate monitor, something was reviving. Not just one person, but an entire family. 3 days after being discharged from the hospital, Margaret returned to the old house, not to visit, but to remember the happy days of the past. The house that Thomas had wanted to sell was now thoroughly cleaned, the old walls repainted in a soft beige color, the wobbly wooden table nailed back together, and the fallen tree in the backyard had been cleared, leaving only a wide pit, like an old wound that had just been opened, waiting to heal. The first week was spent almost sleepless. Margaret couldn't sleep straight through the night. Every time she closed her eyes, she startled at the vague sounds. The sound of thread tearing fabric, the sound of slippers scraping on the concrete floor, the sound of someone breathing heavily beside her. Some nights, she would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, her hands trembling, and her eyes wide open. Thomas would wake up instinctively, wanting to hug his wife as he used to. But every time he touched her shoulder lightly, Margaret would startle, pushing his hand away. Not intentionally, but a reflex of someone who had lived too long in a state of defense. Thomas didn't blame her. He just backed away, sat on the edge of the bed, hugging a pillow, silently waiting for her to feel better. During the day, Margaret tried to maintain a normal appearance. She cleaned the kitchen, folded clothes, watered the plants, but still moved timidly as if any loud noise could break her. Often, while cutting fruit, she would stop midway, look at the knife, then put it down and breathe slowly. Thomas saw everything. He didn't say anything, just stood close enough that if she needed to lean on him, he would always be there. Once, Thomas went into the kitchen and saw Margaret quietly standing in front of the old magnetic board, where she used to write the school schedule, shopping schedule, and notes for Caleb with a felt tip pen. The red pen was still there. Margaret picked it up, hesitant. Then, slowly, she wrote a short line on the board. Friday. Make orange cake for Caleb. Under the line, she drew a small flower. The lines were shaky, but full of effort. Thomas stood silently watching, without saying anything. But that night, he quietly pinned that note to the refrigerator with a heart-shaped magnet, a gift that Caleb had given his mother when he was 4 years old. The first person to help Margaret step out of the door wasn't Thomas, but Caleb. On Thursday morning, as Margaret was sitting curled up in an armchair, looking out the window, Caleb approached, didn't say anything, just held out his hand. She looked up. The boy wasn't smiling, but his eyes were clear. "Mum, come with me." Margaret hesitated for a few seconds. Then she reached out, letting Caleb lead her into the garden, where the fallen tree had been dug up, now a blank space, still nothing planted. "Do you want to plant a tree, Mum?" Caleb asked. Margaret nodded. That day, all three of them went to the nursery at the end of town. They chose a young oak tree. Not big, not exceptionally beautiful, but healthy and with roots touching the bottom of the pot. The seller said, "This tree lives a long time and takes root well. Plant it today, and in a few years, it will shade the entire corner of the yard." Caleb looked at the tree for a long time, and then turned to his mother, asking softly, "In a few years, we'll still be here, right?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She placed her hand on her chest, where the piece of fabric embroidered with Caleb's name had been carefully kept in her pocket since the day of the reunion. "Yes, we'll be here, forever, if we want." That afternoon, they planted the tree. Thomas dug the ground. Caleb watered it. Margaret stood beside them, holding tightly to the wooden sign that she had carved herself that afternoon. Each carving was new, rough, but clear. "This is where Mom waited to be found." She stuck the wooden sign into the ground next to the tree, then stood up straight. In a small drawer, Margaret found an old envelope that said, "Spring seeds. Save them." It was something she had bought before disappearing, planning to plant flowers in the corner of the yard. Instead of putting it away, she took a handful and scattered it around the oak tree, not needing to know if they would bloom. Just simply sowing. All three of them held hands, looking at the tree. No one said anything, only the sound of a gentle breeze blowing through, carrying the scent of new earth, the scent of young trees, and something very much like peace. That evening, Margaret went to sleep earlier than usual. No nightmares, no startling. Thomas lay beside her, not touching her, just placing his hand close, like a silent promise. "I'm here. You can sleep peacefully." Caleb slept in his room, the door ajar, the night light dimly lit. On the desk, the old drawing of the fallen tree was replaced by a new one, the young oak tree, and 3 people standing under the tree, holding hands. Below the drawing, he wrote, "Some things take a long time to heal, but they will heal if someone is willing to stay." That night, as Thomas was cleaning the kitchen, Margaret sat on the porch with Caleb. The two of them didn't talk much. The moon rose high, its light stretching across the newly planted oak tree. Caleb suddenly said, without looking at his mother, "You know what, Mom? I used to be afraid that you wouldn't recognize me if I grew up too fast." Margaret stopped. Caleb continued, "So I tried to keep everything the same. I didn't dare change my room, didn't dare cut my hair, even wore my old clothes again, just so you would recognize me." Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. She reached out, and the boy rested his head on her lap, like when he was little, and she stroked his hair, for the first time in 3 years, in silence, without fearing that she would vanish when she touched her loved ones. The next day, they continued their lives, not rushing, not forcing anyone to be okay immediately. Just that every morning, Caleb would lead his mother to the yard. Thomas would make coffee, looking through the window, this time not to see Margaret walking away, but to see her staying. Every evening, Margaret would become a little more natural. She would sit and watch TV longer. She would smile slightly when Caleb told stories about school. Sometimes she would even take a chair and sit down to carve fruit as she used to, slowly but surely. And one day, when Thomas had just finished setting the table, Margaret came to him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. He turned around, about to ask something, when she proactively hugged him, hugging him completely, with both arms. He stood still, his heart pounding like the day he proposed, a hug that he had waited 3 years, and 9 more days. No miracle happened immediately. No one could forget what had been lost, but some things were gradually returning, little by little, one person at a time, one breath at a time. And in that small house, under the shade of the young oak tree that had just taken root, a family was no longer just surviving. They were beginning to live again. 1 year later, the oak tree in the yard was almost as tall as the porch roof. Its leaves were green and lush, its canopy wide spreading, its roots beginning to spread evenly under the ground, as if it knew this place had once been a wound, so it clung tightly, growing quickly to protect it. The small wooden sign under the tree still stood there, though the rain and sun had faded the words somewhat, but the carved line was still clear. This is where Mom waited to be found. Margaret still kept the habit of watering the tree every morning. Sometimes she sat on the wicker chair next to the oak tree, reading a book. Sometimes she just sat still, her hand on her stomach, where a new life had just been born 2 months ago. Caleb had a little sister. Her name was Hope. One afternoon in June, Caleb sat on the porch steps holding his sister. The wind blew gently, the sunlight glinting through the leaves, creating sparkling gold spots on Hope's soft hair. Caleb looked at the oak tree, then gently leaned down and whispered, "You know what? That tree kept Mom for us." Hope, of course, didn't understand. She just squirmed slightly, then grabbed her brother's sleeve with her tiny hand. Hope was still holding onto his sleeve. Caleb looked at his sister, then smiled. Since the rescue, the town that had turned its back on Margaret's family had begun to change. Old neighbors, who used to whisper behind Thomas's back, quietly left a bouquet of flowers under the oak tree, along with a note. "I was wrong. Thank you for not giving up." A handwritten letter from Caleb's old teacher was sent. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you from the rumors, but it was the look in your eyes that you kept for 3 years that made me believe. Not everyone is lost when they disappear." Caleb's school library posted an article on the main bulletin board. Forced labor. Ring. Busted. Mother. Saved. Thanks to son's memory. Under the article was a photo of the oak tree with a smaller headline, "The Rebirth of a Family." Caleb read that article during recess. Some classmates walked by, not teasing him like before. Some even said, "Hey, that's cool. Your mum is like a superhero." Caleb just smiled. He didn't need anyone to understand everything, just that they wouldn't call his mother someone who had left anymore. Margaret didn't choose to withdraw into silence after everything. She opened a small sewing class right at home, not just to relive her time with needles and thread, but to teach what she had been forced to use as a tool. Women who had lived in darkness like her came, those who had been abused, those who had been trafficked for illegal labor, those who simply needed a place to start over. She named the class Resewing Our Lives. One day near the end of the year, Thomas took out the camera, the one he had forgotten in the dusty corner of the closet. He called the whole family out to the yard. Margaret held Hope in her arms. Caleb stood beside her, holding his mother's hand. Thomas set the camera on the tripod, set the timer, and then ran to stand behind them. The photo captured a very ordinary moment. No one was laughing loudly, no vibrant colors, just gentle sunlight on their faces, and the wooden sign under the oak tree, still standing still, not tilted in the slightest. That photo was printed, framed, and hung right in front of the dining table. Every morning, when the whole family ate breakfast, Margaret looked at it once. Not to recall the past, but to remind herself of something more important. We chose to stay, and we didn't back down. The story of Thomas, Margaret, and Caleb, like the very tree named Memory in their backyard, is not a miracle, but the result of a love that is durable enough not to leave, whether in silence or amidst doubt. And if you, the one who has patiently stayed until these last lines, have ever been misunderstood, have gone through a dark phase where no one believed you, or have had to wait for something that the whole world said was hopeless, please believe. Sometimes what allows us to be seen is not the loudest shout, but the most firmly held memory. Thank you for listening to this story. May you walk away from it with a gentle belief that no disappearance is complete, as long as there is someone who remembers, someone who waits, and sometimes just a hug kept after 3 years is enough for an entire life to be started again from scratch.